There are a lot of questions in psychology and philosophy that go back as far as we can go back in recorded time. And one of those questions that's central to psychology and understanding human nature is something that has traditionally been known as the mind body problem. In recent years, it's come to be known as the mind brain problem. The question is pretty simple. Is there a physical you, the body or the brain, that is made up of protoplasm and biological and chemical processes? And is there a different, separate part of you that is non physical? The mind, the spirit, the essence, the soul. We have all kinds of names for it. Are there two different things? And if there are, what is the relationship between them? That is what the mind body problem has been all about. And there are a couple of many different positions that you can take on this that have been taken throughout human history. One position that can be taken on the mind body problem is known as monism. If you're a monist, you don't really worry about the mind body problem because you don't think there are two different parts of humans. You don't think there's a physical part and a separate mental or spiritual part. You believe there's only one thing. And if you believe that the only thing that exists is the physical you, then you would be described as a materialist. You believe that there's a brain and a nervous system and a body, and they do what they need to do, and there really is no little ghost in the machine that makes you do what you do. There is no non-physical part of you. There's no spirit that lives after the rest of you dies. So if you're a materialistic monist, you don't worry about the mind-body problem. Now, I think there are a lot of materialistic monists walking around in the world today. Less common are people that would be known as idealists. Idealism is the belief that everything is mental and that the physical world is just sort of a construction of the mental or spiritual processes. If any of you have seen the old movie, The Matrix, you've got these individuals who think they're living a real life, but it turns out the whole thing is just a construction of their imagination. That comes pretty close to the way idealists would think about the world. Idealism is kind of out of vogue now. Not too many people in the 21st century are walking around with this belief. But at some places in time, this was the way people felt about the mind. Most people, on the other hand, are dualists. Dualists believe that there are two parts to people, the physical part and the mental part, and that these two parts do have some sort of relationship with each other. And I think your typical person walking around in 21st century America would probably be described as an interactionist. Interactionists believe that there's a separate mind and a separate body, and they influence each other. So they can directly interact in some way. So if you ever find yourself thinking things like healthy body, healthy mind, so being in good physical shape and eating well can make your mind healthy, you're an interactionist. Or if you think that the power of your will can overcome physical obstacles, you can will yourself to be well when you get sick, you're an interactionist. So I think most people think about it this way. Another way of thinking about this is to think of it as the ghost in the machine. Your body is this shell that's inhabited by this spiritual thing. And depending on your religious background, you may believe that the spiritual part of you lives on forever after you die. So interactionism is a very common way of thinking about human nature in the modern world. Another way of thinking about this is something called epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism said that there are these mental events, but they're sort of unimportant and they're just byproducts of physical activity. For example, when I turn on a light bulb, the purpose of the light bulb is to create light so we can see. But if you put your hand near it, you'll see that it's very warm. It's also generating heat. But the heat is not what the light bulb is all about. It's not an important part of the light bulb. It's a byproduct, something that the light bulb generates almost by accident. If you're an epiphenomenalist, this is the way you feel about mental events. The physical stuff is what matters, but a side effect, a byproduct of the physical events, are these mental events. Now, some of these other ways of thinking about it are going to get a little freaky because they're very different from the way we think about things today. Psychophysical parallelism. You've got a separate body and a separate mind. They both react to things that are happening in the world, but they're independent of each other. They don't interact in any other way. So think of them as marching alongside of each other, and they each react separately to things that are going on around them, but they don't interact. Double aspectism. This is a tough one to describe because I can't really wrap my head around it myself. But there is a mind, there is a body. They don't interact with each other, but you can't separate them because it's essential for a person to have both parts. The only way I can think about this that makes any sense is to compare it to a coin. On the one side of the coin, you've got the head. On the other side, you've got the tail. They're facing in different directions. They never see each other. They don't know that the other one exists. But it isn't a coin if it doesn't have a head and a tail. And that's the best I'm going to be able to do with that one. Pre-established harmony. All right, you've got a mind and a body. They're coordinated and synchronized, but there's usually some external agent involved. In some places, it's a kind of a religious view. So you've got your mind and your body marching next to each other, and if they get a little bit out of sync, God or whatever the powerful force is steps in and lines them back up again. Occasionalism. This is another weird one that often involves a god or some other intervening power. Your mind and your body can influence each other, but not directly. They need a middleman. So if I want to raise my left arm, I basically have to ask God to make my left arm raise. I need that intervening agent to have an effect. And so that's a sampling of the different ways that people have thought about the mind-body problem. And in this course, we certainly are not going to be talking about the mind-body problem directly, but we're constantly going to be thinking about what are human beings like, and psychologically, how do we work? And so the mind-body problem is relevant. So if we were to ask psychologists what they thought about the mind-body problem, most experimental psychologists, I'm guessing, I haven't done the survey, would say that they are probably materialists or maybe epiphenomenalists. However, there's another branch of psychology that's known as humanistic psychology. There's also another branch called existential psychology. Together, they've come to be known as third force psychology. You don't need to remember that term. But they formed explicitly as a rebellion against deterministic ways of thinking, like the behaviorism of the 20th century, Freudian theory, and they are devout interactionists. So how am I going to be thinking about the human mind as we go through the course? Here are a few basic principles of my perspectives on the mind. First of all, I'm thinking of the mind as what the brain does. In some ways, I'm going to take the coward's way out and dodge the question about whether there's a separate mind and a separate brain. The brain is doing stuff, and I'm going to be using the word mind to describe that. I also believe that the mind is not just one thing, but it's a collection of things, and I'll get to that in a moment. And the mind is shaped by natural selection just like other parts of the body have been. So our vision works a certain way because evolution has selected it. We grow to be a certain size because evolution has selected that. We have opposable thumbs because evolution has selected that. Well, the brain works the way it does because evolution, through the process of natural selection, has caused it to be so. So the way we think is just as much a product of evolution as the way our bodies are shaped. And surprisingly enough, we're going to talk about consciousness in this course, but it turns out that consciousness is not as essential to most of the functions of the mind as we think that it is. In other words, most of the things we do sort of automatically, and the consciousness is what we're doing after the fact to try to explain to ourselves what just happened. And so the way I'm going to be thinking about the mind is like a Swiss Army knife. A Swiss Army knife is one tool, but it's made up of all kinds of separate tools that are designed for a very specific purpose. So you've got a scissors, you've got a corkscrew, you've got a serrated blade that you can saw with, you've got a sharp straight blade, you've got can openers. Each one of the tools in the Swiss Army knife has a very specific function. Well, I'm thinking about the mind in the very same way. The mind is a collection of tools that each have been shaped by evolution to do a very specific thing for us. And you're going to find a little bit later in the course that when brain damage occurs, for example, it's the equivalent of breaking off one of those tools. The mind is still there. The other functions of the mind work just fine, but the function of the mind that resided in the part of the brain that was damaged has been lost or severely injured. And you'll find that this way of thinking about the mind is very consistent with what we know about the biology of the brain.